Steve Denise here, Director of Business Management with Maizex, and I'm with Greg Stewart, Agronomy Lead. And certainly one of the hot button topics at all the winter meetings across Ontario, particularly west of Toronto this year, was vomitoxin. Right. And it seems like, especially talking with processors, really it was independent. Didn't matter what seed source you had for the year. We seem to see some vomitoxin issues coming out of the harvest of 2016. So Greg, maybe you could spend a few minutes. Let's talk about what caused it. Is there anything we can do when we're planning forward for 2017?
I think the first thing that growers need to be aware of is sort of the two camps that now exist in the vomitoxin threat. And one of them is the traditional camp of silk channel infection that's generally driven by weather and particularly driven by foggy mornings and rainfall events that occur before the silks have a chance to dry up or brown off a little bit. That's that critical window in that silking period. And so that was a problem in 2016. It's been a problem other years. It'll be a problem going forward. That idea of the rainfall, the humidity at that critical window before the silks have dried up.
And I think 2016 we can look at the far southwestern Ontario, where most of if you go, let's say certainly east of London all the way through to Quebec and even from Chatham east, most areas had a very early spring.
Right.
And then when we got into the far southwest, we had a later planting spring, and I think that kind of led to that ideal infection conditions in August.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we all talk about planting early, right? And sometimes there's only so much you can do. But generally, planting early is a strategy that tends to move hybrids out of the more susceptible window, right? And so that's a concern. Again, in some cases, if a grower's really got a sort of an all-out attack on vomitoxin, he will be careful about picking hybrids that are late to flower, right? And try to move things back a little bit to try to prevent that sort of August silk window where you're more likely to pick up vomitoxin infection, right?
And Western bean then?
And then so the other camp is the Western bean cutworm, which for the most part, I guess we say is weather independent, but we have learned a few good things out of 2016, where Western bean cutworm was sort of in the background, right? And now it's sort of moved up to almost carrying equal shares in this vomitoxin risk, right? So fields that may not have had silk channel infection, may not have had rainfall that threatened them from an ear mold, all of a sudden have got Western bean cutworm and holes in the ear that this year were almost always a spot for that vomitoxin to get started where there was a mold start there. And so almost, like I said, independent of weather. And so now we've got sort of public enemy number one is how to control Western bean cutworm. A little bit for the yield loss that Western bean cutworm causes, but much more for the vomitoxin level and the discounts, as you mentioned, that you might experience if Western bean cutworm leads to high vom.
One of the things, maybe you want to comment on this, one of the things I certainly noticed on my own fields this past year was the importance of uniform soil of a seed bed. Right. From the standpoint that it seemed like any of the laggards where maybe it was in a bit wet or it wasn't closed properly, and walking other fields I saw this, that those stragglers really seemed to be the magnet for Western bean.
Yeah, so we've had all sorts of good reasons to try to plant as uniform or to get our crops to come up as uniformly as possible. We'll add one more check in that box now, which is Western bean cutworm risk. And so the Western bean cutworm moths really like to land on the vertical leaves of the corn plant just before tassels emerge, right? And once a field's fully tasseled, they're less attractive to the moths. Yeah. And so you can imagine if you've got a field that's emerged over 3 weeks, right, or even 2 weeks, you'll have all sorts of plants that are still in that sort of tempting phase for the Western bean cutworm to land on, even though maybe 50% of the field is tasseled. If there's still these poor performers, late emergers, they do seem to be a spot that gets beat up by the Western bean cutworm more. I mean, many of us have walked fields. You get those runtier plants, and you look down, and sure enough, there's a hole or two from Western bean cutworm. So we go back to this idea of doing as good a job as possible in terms of uniform emergence for all sorts of reasons, and now including being less attractive or creating a field that's less attractive to Western bean cutworm flying in.
There's always something.
There's always something.
All right. So what we'll do as we go into particularly in the summer months, we're going to talk about in-season strategies for Western bean cutworm, and Maizex will be participating in terms of the trapping networks, I believe, Greg. And
right. We'll be out there in terms of the trapping networks have been ongoing, but most of us are considerably more interested after the 2016 experience to ramp up our level of management on Western bean cutworm, right? And so we'll have to pay more attention to moth flights. Certainly we'll have to get better at looking for those egg masses that are laid on the upper leaves of the corn plant, and be able to get our spray timing right once we've seen those egg masses. We used to talk about seeing if you inspected 100 plants, if you saw egg masses on 5 plants, that was the trigger. That's probably a yield trigger, and Dr. Art Shaftsma from Ridgetown has sort of informed us on that front that 5% might be a yield trigger, but probably considerably fewer plants. That is, you may be at 1 or 2%, or 1 or 2 plants found with egg masses in 100 is probably a threshold for the vomitoxin, and therefore a threshold to get control out on those fields to bring the Western bean cutworm into control with an insecticide.
Yeah, so that's got to be part of the management strategy.
Part of the strategy, right? Yep.
Very good. So vomitoxin. So 2016. Every so many years, we feel that we do have a higher risk situation caused by weather, and now we've got Western bean. So take that into account as we plan towards the spring, and really as we get to mid-season strategies for 17.
You bet.
All right. Very good. Thanks, Greg.
Thank you.